do this on time. Hi, everybody. Now, my plan to start today was to say something obligatory about not liking Trump and making sure you can all trust me from the beginning, but John stole that punchline from me, and so now I'm not exactly sure how I start smoothly. So, I'd like to start with this. Everybody just take a look at this vehicle. That is the 2010 Chrysler 200. I mean, that four-door sedan has 176 horsepower. 0 to 60 in 7.2 seconds. I mean, it's got those beautiful off-chrome wheels. That is the most ideal car you can imagine if you were my great-grandmother. I mean, really, it's the 2010 Chrysler 200 is nothing that special. Now, what's interesting is that this car made its debut the year that Chrysler went bankrupt. And so in 2009, 2010, Chrysler filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and a lot of it was due to low car sales. And so their response to that was to put out that baby, as if it was going to sell more. And in 2009, when they released it, it didn't sell many cars. And then there was a Super Bowl commercial. I don't know if you're familiar with the Super Bowl. It's like the World Cup with a lot of advertisements, where we just sit and watch commercials all night, and every now and then they play sports, if you consider American football a sport. And so one of the commercials during the Super Bowl was for the Chrysler 200. I'm going to show you that commercial real quick.
I got a question for you. What does this city know about luxury? Huh? What does a town that's been to hell and back know about the finer things in life? Well, I'll tell you, more than most. You see, it's the hottest fires that make the hardest steel. Add hard work and conviction, and the know-how that runs generations deep in every last one of us. That's who we are. That's our story. Now, it's probably not the one you've been reading in papers, the one being written by folks who've never even been here and don't know what we're capable of. Because when it comes to luxury, it's as much about where it's from as who it's for. Now, we're from America, but this isn't New York City, or the Windy City, or Sin City, and we're certainly no one's Emerald City.
City, and this is what we do.
Palms are sweaty. Knees weak. Palms are heavy. Just vomit.
Yeah.
Following that commercial, because that's all it is, it's a commercial. Following that commercial, the Chrysler 200 saw a 660% increase in sales volume. Let me ask you something. Did they sell 660% more cars because of that? I mean, it looks like any other car that's been made in the 21st century, or in the 20th century. You know, was it because Eminem was in the commercial, because they had somebody really famous? Well, no, because we have famous people in commercials all the time and we don't see dramatic increases in sales. Was it these chrome rims? No, they hardly even showed the car in the commercial, right? So what was it about that commercial, that short film, that resonated with so many people, that experts say saved the Chrysler Corporation? I would argue that it's because, if you know anything about Detroit, this is a city that's been through hell and back. It's a city that when all of manufacturing left the city, it left it in the depths of poverty. And it's making a renaissance right now. It's rising up from the ashes. Or if you know anything about Eminem, do we follow Eminem here? Yeah, if you know about Eminem and his story of 8 Mile, he's this guy who lived in the depths of poverty and rose up from the ashes. If you know anything about humanity, we can all relate in some way about being in a really difficult spot and then rising up out of it. It resonates with all of us. We can all relate to that story in some way. It was the story that sold millions of four-door sedans. Right? It was the story that connects with us. There's something about stories that resonates with all of us, that we connect with in ways that information doesn't. If they would have just came up there and said, this thing is a 176 horsepower V6 engine, and it does this from 0 to 60, and it's got these type of leather seats, that goes in one ear and out the other. Maybe we retain some of it, but that's not what engages us. But stories are something that we can really resonate with. I was just talking to my kids before you all came in, and my daughter was on the phone, and I just told her, she was like, Daddy, tell stories. She's 2. And so I was like, okay, let me tell you a story from 2,000 miles away. And so my kids love to just sit on my lap without a book, without an iPad, and just listen to stories. It starts from a very young age. There's something about stories that's part of humanity. Does anybody recognize this cave painting? This was found on a cave in France. It's called Lascaux. And they estimate it to be around 35,000 years old. And at first sighting, they thought, okay, they were just recording what animals live near them. But as archaeologists have studied it further, they realized that these cave paintings are actually telling a story. So they were telling stories 30,000 years before the written word. There's a reason that we still can somehow relate to the story of the Odyssey 3,000 years ago. We can all, in some way, maybe connect with this idea of somebody having this goal, this person or this dream, and he will do anything and go on any journey in order to attain it. It sticks with us. It resonates. That's why my high school students roll their eyes when I pull it out. And they're like, oh, we have to learn this. And well, we've been hearing this story for years and years. All of our technologies, long before we wrote, was passed down through stories. Our traditions, our religions, our culture has been passed down through this method of story. There's a reason that when I tell my high school students, when they learn the story of Romeo and Juliet, every year, without fail, I can look around in the room and see girls crying and boys trying, and I'm like, so hey guys, let me ask you, why are you emotional right now? I know that's the question I always ask them, is why do you think they both killed themselves? Why did they end it so tragically? And without fail, they all say, well, because they really loved each other. And so something about being a teenager lasts throughout the ages, right? 500 years ago, they had the same reaction to obsessive love as we do today. And that story of that resonates. There's a reason these stories last for so long. There's a reason that I would bet, and I'm not sure if you've all seen it, but I'm hoping you have, otherwise this joke is going to fail completely. There's a reason we all cried when we saw this scene. Now you look. Right? Because you're like, no! This is a dad who's hard on his son, but he loves him, and it's apparent, and he gets killed by his brother. Spoiler alert. And so, there's something that resonates with us, that we cherish about it. And it turns out, it's not just out of entertainment value that we love stories so much. It's not just because they're so enjoyable to connect with a story. There's actually a neurological component to storytelling. This is a phenomenon really researched and discovered by this group of professors at Princeton University, and it's called neural coupling. Now, I'll try to explain what it is. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'll do my very best. So neural coupling is this idea, or this, discovered phenomenon, that when a storyteller tells a story and it's well told, meaning it has all the elements of story, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, when it has all the elements of story and a suspense and a climax and there's some type of resolution, the listener who's hearing this story, their brains are releasing the same chemicals in the same areas of the brain as the storyteller's brain when the event actually happened. I'll say that one more time. So when a storyteller is telling a story about an event in their life, and I'm telling it all the way through, the listener's brain is forming in the same way, the same hormones are being released in the same areas, in the same synapses as the storyteller brain when it actually happened. And it's so complex that the brain actually forms in new ways when they hear stories, in ways that are permanent, and your brain subconsciously does not even know that they weren't actually at that event. So if I tell a story of big suspense, your brain feels that suspense and it remembers it the same way. Let me give you an example. When I was in high school, which I was about 15 years old, me and my two best friends got on a boat at about 10 o'clock at night, and we wanted to go shark fishing out in the ocean. We were 15 and really smart. And so we got on this boat and we started heading out into the water, and it was one of those perfect nights. I mean, the water was just glassy smooth, and there was this full moon in the sky, and you can just smell the salt in the air. And as we're cruising out, we're feeling like kings with unlimited freedom. So we're moving out there and we're going to catch some sharks because we're tough. And so as we're cruising out, it's this perfect night, and we stop and we throw down the anchor and we throw out our lines. And as we're sitting there, I hear this psst noise. And I look, and on the side of the boat there's a dolphin, and its fin came up right next to the boat. This is a true story. And the dolphin came up right next to the boat and said, "Hey guys, look at that." And then all of a sudden you hear another psst. There's another dolphin, and within about a minute, the boat was surrounded by a pod of about 20 bottlenose dolphins, and they're surrounding the boat. And I literally reached out and I touched a wild dolphin as I'm sitting in the middle of this harbor on the most beautiful night in the world. And in the midst of all this, like this serenity, we didn't even talk, we didn't fish, we just were soaking it in. You hear this rumble off in the distance, out over the Gulf of Mexico. You hear this. That's what it sounded like. And we paid no attention to it, and we stayed in this beautiful moment, this serenity, and in that we heard another rumble, except it was a little bit louder. Again, we're 15. We just kept sitting there. And then we noticed the dolphins started disappearing, and that was as the waves started getting a little bit more choppy. And then there was this warm breeze coming off the Gulf, and it started getting cooler, and the rumble got louder. There was a little bit of a flash. We were like, uh-oh. Guys, it sounds like there's a storm going. Maybe we should head back in. And so they're like, okay. And I said, all right, I'll go pull up the anchor. And my friend Paul, he said, okay, I'll get ready to go. So I'm pulling up the anchor, and as I'm doing that, there's a big flash. And you're like, ooh, it's getting closer, and the boat's getting rocky. And Paul goes, and he grabs onto the key of his little boat, and he turns it, and it just goes. I'm like, what's going on, Paul? He goes, I don't know, it's not starting. Can you go pump the gas? I'm like, sure. So as I'm going back to pump the gas, there's this flash. And if you know anything about lightning, the number of seconds between the flash and the thunder is generally the number of miles, 1.4 kilometers, from the boat. And so there's a flash, and it's 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, boom! And so we're like, uh-oh, it's 5 miles away, Paul, what's going on? So I'm sitting back there, and I'm pumping the gas, and I'm like, all right, try it again. He's like, yeah, I've been trying it this whole time. I'm like, okay, and the waves are starting to slosh over the edge of the boat, and it's picking up, and there's another flash, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, boom, it's 4 miles away now. And so we're sitting there, and I'm like, Paul, come on. And he's like, what do you think I'm trying to do? And so I'm pumping the gas back there, and he's turning it, and it's just not starting, and it's continuing to click. And at this point, my other friend John is in the front of the boat, and he's got a pail, and he's starting to get the water out of the boat. And I've decided, I've got to abandon pumping the gas because that's not working. And so I'm starting to bail too. And there's a flash, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, boom, it's only 2 miles away. And then I swear to you, right in front of us, we watched lightning slam down and hit the water within sight of our boat. And it's raining now, and the wind, and the boat is rocking up and down, and I'm bailing water. And at one point I drop my pail into the water, and I just start panicking, and I look at my friends, and they are bawling. These 15-year-old boys, we are all bawling our eyes out. And I said to them, I'm like, guys, I wasn't planning on dying tonight. They're like, us either. And we're like saying we're sorry that we brought ourselves into this situation, and we are crying. And I'm like, Paul, try it one more time. And as the boat's rocking, he goes and he turns that key. He fires up and he slams the throttle down, and we're riding the waves, and we just took off. And within about 15 minutes, the clouds are starting to become lighter and lighter, and we got away. And I'm just like, it's just water in my face. Allergies this time of year are just horrible. And we cruise away, and we never told anybody that story until right now. So, my mom would have killed me. Now, if I told that story well, your brain, at a deep level, at a subconscious level, doesn't know that you weren't in the boat with me. When I told those stories of suspense, the hormones that are released with, the endorphins that are released when you're feeling stressed and under duress, we're releasing your brain too. That's what a story can do with suspense. Or when the endorphins that I felt when we realized we weren't going to die out on that harbor, those same endorphins are releasing in your brain when you hear a good, well-told story, when you have that resolution to it, when you know that we're not, like 3 high schoolers aren't going to die on the Gulf of Mexico, like those same. And so there's something really, really powerful about stories. And that raises a big question. Why has the dominant education system, at least in my experience, although I think I've talked to enough people this week that would agree that the same is also true here, why is the dominant education system so intent on ripping the story out of the work our students do? Why aren't we harnessing this almost miraculous part of the human experience? Why are we taking it and putting it in rows? And giving information rather than telling stories? Why aren't we utilizing something that's been around the whole of human existence? Why aren't we taking advantage of the neurological power of it, of the emotional power of it, of the entertainment value of it? What if we instead made class into a story? Not just tell a story in what we do, but what if we actually crafted our experiences for our students and us into a story? What if we adopted what I call the epic mindset? So it's seeing the work that you're doing and the work that students are doing through the lens of a story. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is how do you craft the time that students are in your classroom or in your school or your program or wherever it is? How do you view it through this lens of story? So, as a quick review, for those of you who are not paying attention in English class, or what do you call it here? Dutch class. I love that. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to somehow work that into a talk someday. I don't know how. So, for those of you who are not paying attention in Dutch class, literature, I want to kind of do a quick review of the different parts of the story and then talk about how those each can be applied into the work that we do with students. So, the 5 elements of any good story is that it has to have a theme. Who can tell me what a theme is in a story? Is anybody brave?
Environment?
The environment? What do you mean by that?
Where the story takes place.
Close. It's more, and I guess my terminology might be a little off. That would be setting. So I'll just jump ahead. Good. What is the setting of a story?
Environment?
The environment. Excellent. Yeah. So the setting is where the story takes place. It's where it all unfolds. And then what is a theme? Is a yes.
It's like
Thank you.
something that come back in the story all the time, and what the writer or teller has in mind when he makes the story.
Yes, absolutely. It's that lesson that continues to be reinforced throughout a story. So the lesson of my shark story is do not let 15-year-old boys go out on a boat at night. No, actually a theme is a universal lesson. So it doesn't matter what the story and the events that take place, it's something that can apply to all of us. So every story has to have a theme. Conflict as in there's got to be a problem to be solved. Plot. It's the sequence of events that happen throughout a story. And we'll get into those, setting, where it takes place, and then lastly, the characters. They're the ones who are solving this conflict. So I want to start with theme. And how do you have theme in the work that we do in education? So this is the universal lesson. And for me, it starts with, I take a look at the content that I have to teach. This is what has to be covered in my classroom. Whether it's mandated by the school, or the state, or the country, or whatever it is, these are the standards. And usually, when I have a first look at standards, it's not the most intriguing thing in the world, right? I look at, so this is example of history standards that I have to teach from, because I teach history and English, which is equivalent to Dutch. So my history standards, I might look at something like this. This is on industrialization and increasing global interconnections between societies. At first glance, it's like, wow, that was a lot of information. And I think the way my teachers would have done it when I was in school, what they would have said, okay, today we're going to learn about industrialization in Russia. And then they teach you all the facts and information about that. And then we have a quiz, and then we move on to Japan, and then we move on to Britain and Germany. Hey, why isn't the Netherlands on that list? Because what?
We sort of just.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, okay. And so instead, I look at this and I try to figure out, what do I want my students to get out of this unit? What do I want this universal lesson to be for them once we're done doing work within this subject area? And the truth is, or I'll ask, what is important in this? Because if you can't identify something important within what you're teaching, then I'm not sure why we're teaching it. I know that's easy to say because sometimes you're teaching because I told you to teach it. But I think we really have to consider, and if we can't find something important within our standards, we better try our best to find out what we can. So it's finding meaning in what we teach. And so I'll get back to what I did with these standards in a little bit. But I want to point out that you don't have to hit everything in those standards within whatever the story is that you're telling. Sometimes it's just about having a good story in your classroom or a project, and I'm going to talk more about conflict in a minute, about the big problem that has to be solved. The desire to solve that is going to be enough to inspire students to learn these other things. Or I like to put it, I call it the Bieber principle. I didn't know if anybody knows who he is. So I like to think of it as the authenticity of the project, the deep meaning is what's going to drive the content learning. And so I just Googled authentic, and that's who popped up. And so that's how I came up with the Bieber principle. That's not true. I didn't really do that. And so the Bieber principle, the authenticity of the work, the stuff that means something to students, that's going to drive everything else. No matter how complex it is, if they can find out why it's meaningful, why it's actually worth spending time and effort and stress to learn, that's going to drive all of the other learning that takes place. So for instance, at the school I used to work at, there was an algebra teacher and a physics teacher who taught together. So it was a cross-curricular course. And they had a set of standards. It's about exponential growth. The physics teacher had standards on nuclear reactions. And so this is what he had to teach. And he was asking the question, what can I do important with these standards? How do I make students actually interested in graphing functions expressed symbolically? God bless you, science and math teachers. And so this is what he came up with. After going through the brainstorming process, he came up with this idea of his students were to create comic books for a patient at the Children's Hospital in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I'm from. So create comic books, and their comic books had to have a character who was a superhero. And the superhero had to have traits that can be related to the nuclear reaction standards. And so they had to have these traits, and they had to be able to explain it within the story, and it had to be accurate about whatever his powers were. It had to be able to relate to that. And there had to be this exponential growth component. It says there should be a connection to exponential growth decay as well within one character. And so whatever their superhero traits had to relate to that. And so he had them create, using some online tools, some of them hand drew, create children's books using these standards. And then at the end of the project, the students, after they created these books, they took them to the Children's Hospital and they shared them with kids. Right? Like they what is that?
It's a cool name.
Yeah, the super slick scarf chick. Clean up time. So, and then they brought them to kids. And they shared them with them, and then they gave it to them. And so there's this whole service component to it, and it means something to them. And one of the motivators for this project wasn't grades or getting teacher approval or parent approval or even making it to the next level and being able to move on in physics and math. It was to create something for kids who were in the hospital. You know what I mean? That authenticity meant something to our students who created beautiful work. Now, remember the Beaver principle. I don't know why you do this. They didn't hit every one of those standards within that comic book. You know, I mean, you can only fit so many of these complex standards within a single product like that. However, the work that they did on the product was enough to motivate them to do that other work. You know, so when the teacher says, okay guys, today we're going to be looking at these models, and I might have to be up in front of the board explaining some of this, and I might even have you do some practice with it. And then we're going to take some of these concepts and we're going to work on our books later. The kids were really excited about working on these books, which is about all of them. We're willing to sit through the slog and of learning some of that material that had to be done more directly. But the story is being told. That means something to students. There was real conflict within that story. Now conflict, if I told you this story, if I said Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water, then they went down the hill, grabbed a bite to eat, watched some Netflix, and went to bed that night. You think that would have staying power? Do you think that story would have lasted through the centuries and I would still tell it to my kids? Probably not. And why is that? Why is that story less interesting? Because it's not a story, right? It's just a list of events that occurred. He has to bump his head to realize that Jill was willing to tumble down a mountain after him, right? Like there has to be conflict for that to be a story. And I think so often what we do in schools is void of conflict, right? There's nothing motivating this journey to move and create and do other than grades or moving to the next level or parent or teacher approval. When I was a kid, I could care less about grades. I really couldn't. Luckily, I had some teachers who made sure I at least got the minimum required to keep moving on. But many, many, many students don't care about grades at all. And that's why, at least in America, 20% of our students don't even make it out of high school. 20%. That is a major part of our population. I think a lot of that is because there's not real conflict in the work that they're doing. Have you heard of Joseph Campbell? He was the master of myths, and he studied just all the myths throughout history and created this formula that he says all heroes go through. And you can find it in pretty much any good story that you find. You've got this hero who lives in this ordinary world, whether it's a good or bad place, this is what they're used to. But then there's this inciting incident, which is this call to adventure, and they have to leave the ordinary world to go on some type of journey to solve whatever it is. You know, so there's a problem, and that's where they go through, and they encounter a helper, which is a mentor. They undergo obstacles. They die. Yes, absolutely. Think Harry Potter. Oh, I don't want to spoil it. Has everybody ever seen Harry Potter? You've had your time. Lord of the Rings, absolutely. They go through this whole conquest, and throughout that conquest, they change, they transform, and then when they return to the ordinary world, they're no longer the same, right? It's the return. They return. Joseph Campbell called it the gift of goddess, or the return with the elixir. And so after undergoing this conflict, they return changed and better than they were when they left. Think about Lord of the Rings. Frodo returns to the Shire, having gone through this, and he's better because of it. What can we do for students that's going to change them in a transformational way? When I look back at school for myself, I don't really remember very much of it. I was a pretty good kid, so don't get any ideas. There was nothing transforming me. And so with conflict, I try to think, how do I create real conflict in the work that my students are doing? And that starts with brainstorming. And that's looking at the standards, identifying a theme, starting to think about what's important in here, what can I have my students latch on to that will be universal and important to them. And then I kind of jump ahead, and I'm going to explain the climax a little bit more. But then I think, what would the ideal climax to this story be? Like, what's going to be the turning point that's going to change them and transform them so that they're different on the other side of it? So what are they working towards? And then following that is finding some type of authentic audience for our students to create for in some way, whether it's the Children's Hospital, and I'll tell you some more in a moment. But who's the authentic audience? How do we make this real to them so it's not just something they go home and hang on the refrigerator, but something that's actually making a difference somewhere? And to do that, and I won't spend much time on this, but to do that, it's about cold calling. You know what I mean? It's about reaching out to people in the community, asking for help, asking them to be a part of the work that your students are doing, and which can be a little intimidating, by the way. As I said earlier in my workshop, it's not part of our teacher preparation program, at least in my experience, to be able to pick up the phone and call a professional and ask them to be a part of what my students are doing. There's something intimidating about that. But let me tell you that most community members are going to be ready and willing to be a part of what your students are doing. Whether that's because your students have something really valuable to contribute to their work, it's also them getting to be a part of the community, and it's good PR. And so finding somebody authentic for your students to work for and with. So let me give you an example. These are the standards I showed you earlier on industrialization and global interconnection. And I looked at these and I tried to figure out, what do I find? Where's a common theme here that my students can take away from this? And something I know, if you know about industrialization, this is like a time period where the world dramatically changed the human experience, where we went for thousands and thousands of years, the fastest way to get around was on the back of an animal. And then like George Washington and Julius Caesar both rode around on horses. And then within a 150-year period after the steam engine was invented, we can take rocket ships up to the moon. So you've got this rapid progression. It's called modernity. And I can see that throughout these standards, this idea of modernity. I think that's something important for my students to learn. So I started asking, okay, how can my students grasp what modernity is? How can they understand that concept and make it meaningful to them? And so I thought about, what am I passionate about? What would I have fun and learning more about that I think they would as well? And so I've had a heart for refugees for quite a while, and just the plight they go through, and that there's opportunities for them, a safe haven in many places, and yet it's not always the most welcoming place to be a refugee in America. And so I thought, when you think about like what a refugee has to go through, when they get to America, it's like their own industrial revolution in a matter of minutes rather than decades. Are you with me? Right? Like if you're coming from a place that has very low technological advancements, and then all of a sudden you come into the 21st century, Grand Rapids, Michigan, that can be a big shock. And so I reached out to a refugee agency in Grand Rapids, and I asked, would anybody be willing to come and share their story with my students? And so on a Monday morning, a woman named Beth Lisa came and sat and met with my kids. Now, Beth Lisa was from Rwanda, and she lived there in the early 1990s when there was a genocide. And Beth Lisa took refuge during the genocide in a hotel, which you might have heard of, the Hotel Mikakalin. And she spent several weeks in the hotel, and while she was in there, her husband was murdered with machetes. And then following, when she was able to get out of that, she went to a refugee camp in Kenya, where she lived for well over a decade on nothing more than rice and corn. And her children were born in this refugee camp. And that was her first part of her story. And then she told my students how one day she finally got the notification that she was going to get to leave this refugee camp. And they told her, you're going to Grand Rapids, Michigan. And it was January. If you know anything about Grand Rapids in January, you can turn down the temperature about 15 degrees from what it is here. And so Beth Lisa from Rwanda, who lived in Kenya, ended up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We had a big snowstorm that year. And she thought the snow falling from the sky was from a volcano nearby. She thought it was cold ash. And she told my students on the first day that she got there, she got on a city bus and didn't know how to pull the string or push the button to get off of it. And so she stayed on the bus for 8 hours because she didn't know how to signal to get off. Until finally the driver reached the end of his route and made her get off in January during a snowstorm. When a police officer offered to help her, she rejected, because where she's from, you don't talk to police officers. So she spent the entire night outside. And she's telling this to my students. She's telling them how she didn't know how to operate a toilet, and how she didn't know how to work the light switches and use the appliances in the apartment that she was living in. And my students are hearing this story and they're shocked. Like, how could anybody in Grand Rapids, Michigan have this experience? And so when Beth Lisa left that morning, we went through this whole process of talking about what she went through and asking questions. Guys, what do you do about this? Are you okay with this? because there was something very unsettling about it. And so my students decided, you know what if we created tools very simple tools that could explain some of these things to refugees when they get here. And what if we presented these tools to a refugee agency and see if they're interested in using any of them in their program? And so for the next month, as I taught these standards, my students created these tools. And one group created these flashcards that they called a local agency and had translated into Swahili about how to use different appliances and light switches and plugs and some of the simple things we take for granted. We had one group went to the city bus and they filmed a whole how-to video on how to use the bus system. We had students create how to use the public library, because that's where many refugees get internet access and can apply for jobs. And they went through all these things that my students already know how to use. And they created these tools and then they presented them to the refugee agency. And then afterwards, the agency said, we want to use this one, we want to use this one. This one wasn't really high quality, we're not going to use that one. And my students got to see their work getting used. And the students whose work didn't get used, they got explanations why. And they learned something about professionalism and excellence and details. And my students embraced modernity and learned this theme in a way that they never would have if it was just me standing up there lecturing about it. Now, I also want to point out, we still assess content. My students still wrote essays and they wrote historical fiction, and they had to, and this is just a little snippet of some of the work that they had to do throughout this project. But they were still getting that content that I would have taught otherwise. However, now when they're writing historical fiction about the experience of somebody from Rwanda, it's not this abstract idea. It's instead something that they lived with a little bit and worked with and learned to empathize and created and use their hands and their creativity and collaboration. It became something that was real to them. Now, I really believe this, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. You know, the more we present students with real challenges that really motivate real work, the more glorious the triumph is going to be. You know, a project like that comes with a lot of stress to it. Because when you've got an agency coming to see your work that you've been creating, there's high standards for it, right? Like, I can't afford to not capitalize my I's if they stand alone. And I can't just write the word you with the letter, right? Like, I have to actually pay attention to these details, and I got to make sure my stuff is accurate. And so students are learning all of these skills and content through this lens of story, through this work. And it's by presenting real content of the work that they're doing. The next piece of literary element is plot. How do we outline the work that they do in this sequential way so it's meaningful in that way? And so every plot starts with the exposition. Every story has this exposition. It's the inciting incident. It's whatever. It's where that conflict is introduced and sets the heroes on the journey to go and solve it. And so this is a woman named Deet Eamon. You heard of her? So Deet was born in Haag. Is that pronounced correctly? Haag, just south of
Den Haag?
Den Haag. Oh, jeez, come on, Muir.
I don't know.
That's right. It's just south of Amsterdam.
Everything.
What is this?
Everything is
Den Haag.
Den Haag? Den Haag?
I did okay. So
In English, you say The Hague.
The Hague. So she was born in The Hague in 1920, and then when World War II occurred, and Jews were severely persecuted in the Netherlands, Deet joined the Dutch resistance, and her fiance, I think his name was Hans, they started sneaking. Hans. They started sneaking Jews out into the countryside and hiding them, and that was Deet's role until she was captured by the Nazis and put in a concentration camp, where her fiance was murdered at Dachau. I'm not going to pronounce it, but what's the name of the concentration camp? Dachau. So her fiance was killed there, and Deet was kept there until she was liberated by the Allied forces. And so she's got this tremendous story about what she did. And then it turns out that Deet currently lives as a 94-year-old woman in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the town that I live. And so when I found that out, I'm like, holy smokes. We have this war hero, this hero of the Dutch resistance, living 3 miles from where I work. I've got to have her talk to my students. And so that's what we did. And so I brought my students to go and talk to Dee. And they heard her whole story, and she's showing like maps that she drew from her cell, and she still has the star that she wore. And my students are getting to hear from this hero 70 years later. And then it became like, okay guys, what do we do with this? Because most people in our community do not know that we have one of the leaders of the Dutch resistance living a couple miles from our school. That's a problem, right? There's a conflict there. What do we do about it? And so that was the inciting incident for this story. When they got to speak with Dee, it became, okay, we've got to do something about it. And so we started moving. There was a story. And so our students decided, let's create documentaries. Let's go and meet with different war heroes from our town, World War II heroes, as well as Dee. And let's record their whole story. And we'll create documentaries out of it. We'll create artwork, podcasts, and these different things. And let's hold a big event in the community square and a theater downtown. And we'll invite everybody out, and we'll have the vets there as the guests of honor. And so for the next month, it became the rising action of the story being built to this climax. Now, part of the rising action was actually going and interviewing World War II veterans, meeting them, using whatever we had. Some students had these cameras from home, others took their iPhones and used tape to tape them onto a box. And they got to hear from real World War II heroes, real people who are still around but not for long, got to record their stories with the intent of making sure that nobody forgets the work that they did. But in the midst of all that, in the midst of the rising action, we also studied World War II, and we wrote about it, and they took a test on it. This is a little side story. One day, one of my students wasn't able to go to the interviews with us when we went to interview the veterans, and so she went on the next day during the class. She said, "Oh, can my mom take me to the interview and then drop me off at class after?" I'm like, "Sure, Mia." And so I'm sitting there, I'm teaching that next day after the interviews, and Mia comes into my classroom, and I'm working with a student. She's got, her eyes are like blood red, and she's crying. I'm like, "Mia, what's going on?" And I'm thinking she just must have heard a really sad story or something like that. And she goes, "Mr. Muir," this is funny, I shouldn't laugh. "Mr. Muir, did you know that we dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan?" "I did know that, Mia." She's like, "Why did we do that?" And so, and I'm sitting there, I've got 2 thoughts. One, I'm not sure, well, I got 3 thoughts. One, I'm not sure why we did that. 2, that's pretty powerful. And then 3, I already told you that. Why didn't you hear me when I told you guys about this atomic bomb, right? Like, I clearly put that in my lesson. But when she heard it from somebody who was on a boat 10 days later and pulled up to Nagasaki, now all of a sudden it came to life, right? Now this learning was no longer this hypothetical thing happening with a teacher at the front of the room, but now it was being delivered by somebody who was there. And that really helps content work. That really helps student engage with the content that I'm teaching, the subject matter, because all of a sudden it's real in some way. It's got meaning, it's got a theme. And so at the end of this project, after we did all of this work, we got to the climax. This is what it's all been building to. And let me tell you, the rising action is full of trials. There was a lot to change students along the way, but then we got to the climax. I got this local theater to lend us some space for an evening, and we had over 400 people from the community show up to watch these films, and in the front row it was occupied all by World War II veterans and one of the leaders of the Dutch resistance. Now you tell me, if you're a student, would this inspire you? This didn't take money. I didn't spend a dime on this project. They used all their own technologies. They just had to be inspired to want to do this work. And that's what good conflict does. Right? We can't avoid conflict. We have to make sure our students are introduced to it. Because the only changes that we ever feel, or the dramatic changes, are usually from conflicting times. Right? Think about the most growth you've had as a human being. Was it from vacation? Was it from like like times of luxury and play. Those are good, but I get bored on vacation after a while. It's usually from the tough stuff, from the tragedies that we experience, through the challenges. I think the same is with school. When we present students with challenges and real conflict, that's when transformation can occur.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
It's a great story. But now I'm in conflict with myself because you showed us the good practice of taking on these actions. But it took you 4 weeks. In my program that's 2 hours. So how do I deal with this? How do I deal with this conflict of programming in time versus your approach?
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic question. One that I don't have time for. So anyway, you know, I hear that a lot from math and science teachers, especially math teachers who have a lot of different standards that they have to attack within a very small amount of time. And so I'll tell them about a project and they say, that's really great, but I've got 100 standards I have to achieve in the next month. And so I think it's about having an overall conflict that maybe your standards really don't even relate with at all, but can you have a theme that can all be tied together in some way? Or is it just about doing lessons and maybe having a little bit less authentic conflict, but still trying to find ways to make the work relevant and authentic to students? I think that's what it boils down to. Is the work that we're doing, is it authentic to students? Does it actually mean something more than grades? I'm going to skip this video because I'm running out of time, but that's just an example. I'd be happy to share this slideshow as well. And then at the end of every project is the denouement, the resolution. It's got to wrap up. You've got to feel like you've achieved something at the end of it. With this, it's reflection. It's having students reflect on the work that they do. Having them tell the story of the project. You know what I mean? Because that's when the neurocoupling can occur. I often have students who are not even in English class still do writing over the work that they do, just so they can be reminded of what they did, adding in those details, connecting with a story. So every story has to have resolution in some way. Setting, I'm kind of speeding it up because I realize how long I'm going. Setting, where the story takes place, is absolutely essential. Has anyone ever seen the film The Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner? It's a baseball film.
I have.
Yeah, thank you. It's a story that has to take place in Iowa. It wouldn't work anywhere else. It has to have cornfields. If it happened in a city, it wouldn't be the same story. Finding Nemo could not take place in Phoenix, Arizona. Like, fish got to swim, birds got to eat. Yeah, it sure is. So where it takes place is absolutely essential. One of these pictures is from 100 years ago. Another one is from last year. You see much difference in the setting of our school culture? And sometimes I try to tell myself, no, we're not doing this industrial style of school anymore. But then I walk through the hallways of so many schools and I still see the exact same layout all the time. This was created for an industrial world where our students went to school until they were about 14, they became literate, and then they dropped out like my grandfather did and went to work in a factory for 40 years. And that's why you have to learn how to sit in rows and listen to a bell and follow a manual. Our workforce is changing. Shouldn't our education reflect that? Shouldn't we be doing work that simulates the real world? Or shouldn't we make the work we do in the classroom actually the real world? I talked about in my workshop earlier, some work can be applicable, it can apply to later on. But when my students are creating documentaries, that's not learning how to talk to elders and present and create fine work so that you can do it later on. It's so you can actually do it now. Are you with me? That's authentic. It's actually happening in that moment. It's not just, oh, I'm preparing for the real world. No, class is becoming the real world. And so I think our setting should simulate that. You know, having kids being able to collaborate. That's one of my big noticing from my time here with you is there's such a great collaboration culture here. And I don't know if it's just this specific group or if that's in the culture, but it seems like people know how to face each other and talk and work through stresses and come to solutions. I think we've got to teach that. You're not a born collaborator by nature, I don't believe. I think we have to teach, or at least give opportunities where we can refine that. And then lastly, what time do we need to be done? 2. I got another. Oh, it's 2. I'm low on time. So, there's two types of characters. There's a static character and a dynamic character in literature. Static, they don't change. Dynamic, they are much different than they were at the beginning. Can I wrap up by telling you a poem? Would that weird you out if I told you a poem? Nobody's answering. I'm guessing it will, but I'm going to do it anyway. Because I got the clicker. You're just in time for a poem. In Dutch. I know a girl who is 14 but is forced to be 40. She fiddles with the latchkey hidden in the pocket of her ripped jeans as she watches that hour hand hit 3 and 6 hour, signaling she's now on the clock. Now, she doesn't go to school clubs or swim practice or run home and catch a nap on her mattress, no. This girl walks 2 miles to a government-funded daycare where she picks up her 2 little sisters and carries the pair 2 more miles to her 2-bedroom home. Her dad will be back at 11 and his next shift starts at 7, and her mom, she's been out of the picture for over a year. And so this girl has to clean up her dad's half-empty cans of beer as she tries to steer the youngest from sticking a fork in a socket. And on the other side of the room, the other sister's temper bursts like a rocket because this girl won't let her have a piece of chocolate before dinner. Now, if it was me, my patience would be growing thinner, but this girl has this funny face she makes that almost always alleviates even the most severe angry outbreaks. And she has to rely on this look when she cooks supper for 3, and it's usually something soft and cheap like ramen or macaroni. And then after eating last, doing dishes, giving baths, brushing hair, trying to find 2 sets of clean pajamas for her sisters to wear, giving the older child 2 puffs from her Advair, then soothing the baby's cries and reading Goodnight Moon 3 times. This girl sits at the table and does her homework. I'm a lot of blanket moment. How do you standardize her story? Wrap it up real nice on a test and send it back to the state to report on her progress? Can I send my president her story and convince him that results happen outside of the SAT standardized test? Can I let my principal know that the C this girl received in English class signaled more than the fact that she passed, but that this 14-year-old who works a second shift was standing on the tip of Everest, but is now another step away from that precipice? And I can see it in her bright green eyes that this girl knows that she's going to ski down this mountain instead of tumble. Because you see, I teach this girl without worrying what the test will say. And I remind her that someday you'll be able to write on your resume that you can work well under pressure. And when an interviewer asks, you can give concrete examples of your ability to multitask. And you can tell that story of how you passed every last class while raising your 2 little sisters. And someday, when you have your own little girl, you'll be able to rock her to sleep at night. And you'll know what face to make to cool tempers. And you'll be able to teach your daughter how to mountain climb. I want to end it there because I'm out of time. I want to tell you one more thing. This girl's name is Sarah. And Sarah was this very lackadaisical girl in my class. And I remember that when I first met her, she'd just sit there and she would do nothing. Wouldn't turn in work, wouldn't show any effort. And I remember one day I walked up to her and she was sleeping. I said, "Sarah, wake up." And she just looked at me with that blank stare. And then I went by another time. I said, "Sarah, wake up." Finally, I didn't know what to do. And I was talking to another teacher and they said, "Hey, you said you were going to check in with Sarah. What's going on?" I said, "I don't know, that girl is lazy." And then I found out Sarah's story a little bit later on. I found out that all those things I listed in that poem are absolutely true. That she really does take care of her 2 little sisters, and she really does have to navigate how to make sure they get their inhalers so they don't have asthma attacks, and she has to do all these things on top of the work that she does in school. And so it was like this moment where I realized that I'm entering Sarah's story. Are you with me? She's already doing something here, and I'm becoming a part of it. And so how do I make a girl like this? How can I get her interested in the work that we're doing in this classroom? And part of that was just realizing that I've got to make the work that we do in this classroom meaningful to her. We did this project where students learned about imperialism. Are you familiar with imperialism? Yeah, so about imperialism and the effects that it had on these countries, and how even though imperialism's been removed for decades now, the effects in those countries are still very, very common. Yeah, I mean, like there's still poverty and civil war, and all this is happening in those places that were imperialized. And there is a group that does something called microfinance in Africa. Are you familiar with microfinance? It's this idea that most people who live in Burundi, Africa, wouldn't have the credit to be able to take out a business loan. And so they rely on handouts from other countries. But what microfinance does, it takes a group of people and they can apply for a loan corporately. So let's say 15 people or 30 people apply for a $30,000 loan. Each one of them gets a segment of that loan, and they have to start their own businesses and do this work. But when it's time to pay the loan back, they pay it back corporately rather than individually. And so I had somebody who works for a microfinance bank come and talk to my students about this and the work that they were doing. And when she left, my students were like, whoa, this seems like this could actually be more than a Band-Aid for the wound caused by imperialism. This could be something that heals it. And so after the whole brainstorming process, they had their conflict in mind. It became, okay, what do we do about it? And so I was able to get my principal to loan me $300. She said, why am I giving you $300? She said, trust me. So I took this $300 and I gave each group of students that got into groups $10 a piece, and their goal was to take this money and somehow raise as much money as possible in the next month. This is your microloan. Now, they weren't allowed to sell drugs or anything Dutchish. I'm sorry, I needed a little bit. People have been hammering me about Trump for 3 days. And so that's what they did. They created these businesses, and there were kids selling chocolate in the hallways and coffee before school. And we had one group took a paintball gun and they went door. Do you have paintball guns? They went door to door in their neighborhood, telling neighbors for $10 you can shoot me with your paintball, my paintball gun. And they made like $70. They made a lot of money doing this. And then at the end of the project, we collected all the money, we paid back the loan just like you would in Burundi, and we took the remaining money and using this really cool service called Kiva, we loaned the money to an actual group of people in Burundi. And then when that money gets paid back by the people in Burundi, they pay the loan back, we'll take it, and we donated, or we didn't donate, we loaned it to another group, and we were all of a sudden a part of history in some way, right? Like it was no longer just imperialism as a concept, it was, whoa, this is what happened, this is what we can help do about it. I want to show you this real quick. This is a knit hat that Sarah made. Or she didn't make it for me, I had to buy it. She made it for the project. She spent many nights making hats just like this one and selling them at school and to parents. And all of a sudden, this girl who I couldn't get to do anything because she was so tired was inspired by something. Maybe it was hearing the stories of Burundi and there was something about their plight that she could relate to. Maybe it's because Sarah's really good with working with her hands. She's been doing it her whole life. But whatever the reason, she woke up with this project. She created this. And at the same time, she also created essays and wrote about it and dug into the content. Because she was inspired by real conflict, authentic conflict. She was in a setting that allowed her to do this work. She learned lessons that the content contained, and the project opened it up for her. And so I want to leave you with this. It can be hard to think of authentic conflict for our students. It takes some creativity to think about how do I make the work we do real, authentic, and engaging. I've got good news for you. In the words of Sir Ken Robinson, teaching is a creative profession. So thank you so much for your time. You didn't think you were going to hear a poem today, did you? I teach English. And then I only have a few copies with me. If you'd really like one, I've got 4 of them. But I also wrote a book that's all about this. I go much more into detail of the process and how to actually do it and brainstorming. So if you want to check that out, it is on Amazon. But I would love to start any dialogue with you about that. And then you can get in touch with me through my website, epiclassroom.com. And feel free to shoot me any messages or questions or anything you'd like to talk about with that. And also here is my contact information. So thank you so much. Sorry I went over a little bit.
Thanks a lot.